So this session's really about understanding genetic diversity within the Angus breed and maintaining that. So when we look at genetic improvement, sustainable genetic improvement's a balancing act. So what we're trying to balance is improvements in genetic merit whilst trying to maintain that diversity within the breed. And so it's all right if you make massive gains, but you've got to try and balance it out in the end. Why is genetic diversity actually important? Well, because losses in heterozygosity or differences in genes can actually result in a depression in performance. So we all understand hybrid vigor. We actually get the opposite when your inbreeding levels are too high, and it's called inbreeding depression. So we really want to manage that and ensure that's not impacting the performance of our animals. Losses in genetic variation can also reduce our ability to respond to particular areas with our breeding program. And we want to be able to respond to the changing environment that breeding programs need to reflect. And the last bit is that increases in homozygosity, or the same genes within the population, can actually lead to the expression or increased risk of expression of undesirable genetic conditions. So we obviously want to steer clear of genetic conditions, and part of that's about managing genetic diversity within the breed. So as part of a larger project that Angus Australia is involved with, Dr. Sam Clark from the UNE has done a bit of work looking at where genetic diversity is at within the Angus breed, basically from 1990 until the current day. And really, when we talk about genetic diversity, there's really three key measures that you can look at. The first one's around inbreeding, the average inbreeding coefficient. So we all understand inbreeding coefficient from the mating predictor. So it's looking at that at a breed level. You can look at the effective population size of the breed, and the last bit's looking at the number of ancestors or influential founder animals within the population. And so Sam did all this. So when we look at the average inbreeding coefficient for the Angus breed, what we see is since 1990 that the level increased up until about 2011, after which point it started to subtly plateau off. So again, that's not a bad thing. It's all about understanding the genetic improvements in genetic merit and that balance. And so there were significant improvements in merit over that period. And so you saw that the balance occur. Till today, where the average inbreeding coefficient for 2018 sits at 0.03. So that's a really good level to be at. When we talk about the second measure of genetic diversity within the breed, what we see is that the effective population size for the Angus breed is around 100. So really, once you get below 50, you've got a problem. So sitting at around 100, we're in a good spot. And that really represents good management from Angus breeders. The last little bit's really about understanding the influential animals and those animals that have had a big influence on the breed. And so Sam somehow found some spare time and used it to develop this really cool animation which actually plots the number of progeny by bulls over that time period from 1990 until current. And so we'll just flick that and let that play, and what we see is that you see bulls like Scotch Cap in the early 1990s really well represented and with a large number of progeny. Again, when viewing this, it's really important that we understand it in relation to that inbreeding coefficient curve where we saw it increasing up until 2011. So at the moment in the graph we're still increasing, but after that 2011 it started to plateau off. So you see bulls like Future Direction and New Design with really high levels of progeny up until sort of 2011, after which point some of the other bulls, sort of those lower rankings, start to increase their numbers relative to the top two. So it's one thing to produce a lot of progeny, but the real question is that not only did you produce a lot of progeny, but were you influential? Did you have a big impact on the Angus breed? And that's where this next graph and animation really comes in, because what it's looking at is how influential you were with the progeny that you produced, I guess. And so there's two key bits here. The number beside the bar represents the proportion of genes that can be attributed to that animal. Importantly, that unlike the last list, which was just size, this one's got some females in there, so there could be a female having a big influence. And the other part too is that if you've got a sire of a sire who is influential, the sire of that sire may get the benefit because the genes can be traced back to him and he's the original source. And so when we let this play, what we see is a different list from the progeny, and potentially maybe not as well known as the other list, because these bulls are potentially the sires of those bulls or grandsires of those bulls that we saw. But again, understanding the inbreeding coefficient curve in relation as this animation goes through is really important. So what we see is that it takes a lot longer for bulls like New Design to reach the top of the list, despite having a significant amount of progeny in the population. And what we see is New Design really and Future Direction being up there, and representing that significant progeny. But what we also see is that some of those other guys further down the list are potentially having an influence on the population. So what do we take away? What are the take-home messages from this presentation looking at genetic diversity within the Angus breed? Well, inbreeding increased steadily until 2011, and some of you guys that have been around during that period will understand what happened and the use of bulls during this period. After 2011, which it started to plateau off. That there's sufficient genetic diversity, whichever way you look at it, inbreeding coefficient of 0.03 within the 2018 Angus population, an effective population size around 100. We're in a good spot. But as Angus seed stock breeders, we really need to remain vigilant around the mating allocations that we're making, and that's all about understanding the inbreeding of the matings we're proposing, and we can do that with a mating predictor. Well, there's also tools like MateCell, which can be really valuable in assisting us with these breeding decisions.